Good evening, everyone. It's good to see so many of you out after the CLP bonanza of last night, and there are still people coming out for politics today, too. That's great to see. I want to welcome all of you to the second night of our first Tocqueville event of the 2024-25 academic year. My name is Brent Nelson, and I'm the director of the Tocqueville Center for the Study of Democracy and Society, and a member of the Department of Politics and International Affairs. Before we get started, I do want to I want to thank a few people for putting on an event like this. We don't do this often enough, but I thought early on I'd like to give opportunity to thank a few people. So first of all, the Tocqueville Center has a very small staff. And none of us are full-time, but I do want to recognize the other two that are here. Lucy Southwell is over here. She really does everything logistical. She is absolutely amazing. Jim Guth down here, he's our senior distinguished scholar and the man behind all of the good ideas that we come up with. And of course me. So that's the whole staff. Now, there are Tocqueville Fellows out there, and they're the hands and feet of this organization. I want all of you who are here to stand up. Oh, we have a good crowd tonight. Very nice. Thank you very much. There are 21 in all, and they don't all work at every time. And I want where's Sim Carlson? Sim Carlson. There you are. Everybody else sit down. You remain standing. He's our Tocqueville Fellow intern this year, and he's my right-hand man. If he weren't there, I don't know. I wouldn't be here. So thank you very much, Sim, and look forward to the work that you'll be doing. We also did have last night, I don't see her today, Amy Walters is the daughter of Ernest J. Walters. Tonight is a night that we call the Memorial Lecture Series, or one of the lectures in the Walters Memorial Lecture Series. He was a legend at Furman. And in honor of the many, many students that he nurtured and mentored over the years, those students established an endowment fund, and that is helping us produce this event today. So, but Amy is the representative of the family. She was here last night, but she did not make it tonight. We trust you are excited about tonight's event and the slate of events we have planned for this year. I hope you received one of those brochures as you came in the door. It details the speaker events that we will have during this year. The Tocqueville website contains even more information that you may wish to peruse at your leisure, and you can certainly click on a button that says, give us your email, and then you will get all the emails about these events. What are we about at the Tocqueville Center? The Tocqueville Center is dedicated to exploring the big questions concerning our common political, economic, religious, and social lives asked by the best minds, past and present. Alexis de Tocqueville, the 19th century French aristocrat, social scientist, philosopher, politician, and world traveler, is one of the great minds of the past who addressed many of these big questions. His classic book, Democracy in America, for instance, asks how a commitment to social equality changes the nature of society and the way it is governed. His answers shed light on deep truths about early America and its pioneering people, and his predictions proved prescient. Last night, Sarah Gustafson took us on a deep dive into Tocqueville's fear of the soft despotism of the administrative state under conditions of equality. She then connected that to Tocqueville's ideas on how to address the growing mass of impoverished workers in newly industrializing nations that would require state intervention, leading to increased soft despotism. Believe me, she has all of us thinking deeper than we ever have about these issues. Tonight, Professor Zunz, our second Walters lecturer, will take us in a very different direction as we bring Russia into the conversation. Our format tonight will be familiar to any of you who have attended our events last year. We will first hear from tonight's featured speaker, Professor Zunz, who will then be joined by two additional scholars, Professor Gustafson and our own Professor Mike Bressler, for a panel discussion that will also include questions from the audience. So to begin, let me introduce tonight's speaker. Professor Olivier Zunz is James Madison Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Virginia. Think about that for a second. He's the James Madison Professor at Virginia. Just saying. He was educated primarily in France before moving to the United States over 4 decades ago. He has received fellowships and research grants from the Ford Foundation, Japan Foundation, Foundation Center for Global Partnership, John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities, and the National Science Foundation. He has authored or edited 12 books, including Philanthropy in America, a history which Sarah mentioned last night, and his most recent book, The Man Who Understood Democracy, The Life of Alexis de Tocqueville. Tom Clark back there has already had Professor Zunz sign his personal copy. You should get one, read it, and I'm sure if you go up to Charlottesville, he'll sign it for you, right? Yeah. So Professor Zunz's long list of accomplishments and awards can be found in the brochure. We are delighted to have such an eminent scholar addressing us today. Please join me in welcoming Professor Zunz.
Well, thank you, Brent, so much, and I'm truly delighted to be here. It's a great honor, and also it's a beautiful place that I just saw for the first time today. Spent time walking around the lake and finding a nice place to sit this afternoon and read for an hour or so. And I was thinking, well, I should do this more often. So the title of my lecture here is The Great Debate Between Alexis de Tocqueville and Astolphe de Custine, an unusual first name, on the political fortunes of America and Russia. So let me start this presentation today by quoting a familiar passage from the first volume of Democracy in America, actually just toward the end of it, from the book Tocqueville published with such success in 1835. And in this well-known passage, Tocqueville is contrasting the US and Russia. And he says, there are today 2 great peoples on earth who, though they started from different points, seem to be advancing towards the same goal. The Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Both grew in obscurity, and while humanity's gaze was focused elsewhere, they abruptly vaulted to the first rank among nations. The world learned almost simultaneously of their birth and their grandeur. To achieve his goal, the American relies on personal interest and allows individuals to exercise their strength and reason without guidance. The Russian, in a sense, concentrates all the power of society in one man. The American's principal means of action is liberty. The Russians, servitude. Their points of departure are different, their ways diverse, yet each seems called by a secret design of providence to sway the destinies of half the globe. So there we were, Tocqueville's great prediction in 1835 of a bipolar world. These lines were quoted repeatedly during the Cold War, and they were often heralded as evidence of Tocqueville's ability to see the future, to be the great seer. In fact, Tocqueville conveyed a view widely shared at the time. There's nothing terribly original in those lines in 1835. They were said over and again on both sides of the Atlantic. From Alexander Everett in the US, Everett had assisted John Quincy Adams in Russia when Adams was American minister there. So from Everett to Bruno Bauer, who was Karl Marx's mentor in Germany, to the Abbé de Prat in France. The French press in the 1830s and 40s discussed this often in many articles. Many commentators in the 30s recognized the potential for the two great powers to dominate the world. And in French politics in those days, there were those who favored an alliance with the Tsar to guard against Germany, the German threat. And there were those who saw America as protecting Europe from the Russian threat. And some others hoped that Europe, by standing in the middle between America and Russia, would control both of their ambitions. So there was just Tocqueville's pronouncement. The second character in my story today is another French aristocrat by the name of Astolphe de Custine. The Marquis de Custine was as anti-American and against democracy in the name of monarchy and tradition. He was as against democracy as Tocqueville was pro-American and pro-democracy. That Custine's grandfather had joined Lafayette, had fought at Yorktown, had met George Washington, that made no difference. Custine was born in 1790, 15 years older than Tocqueville, and he was the voice of legitimism, that is, of loyalty to the Bourbon kings and devotion to aristocratic morals. Custine, for a long time, embraced Russia as the repository of the proven value of despotism against democratic leveling, until he eventually changed his mind, and as we will see, wrote a famous indictment of Russia. So if Tocqueville's Democracy in America, his book of 1835, was truly the bestseller of the 1830s, Custine's final attack on Russia, published in 1843, Russia in 1839, but published in 1843, was truly the bestseller of the 1840s. Custine challenged Tocqueville in the name of despotism. And then he reversed his judgment by resorting to key Tocquevillian concepts in building a new analysis and attack on Russia. And this is the story I want to recreate today. How did he go from one to the other, and what did he borrow from Tocqueville? It's not a terribly important story. It's a little piece of erudition, if I may say. But nonetheless, it's about two great authors and the two bestsellers of the mid-19th century, so there is something to it. Now, Tocqueville and Custine were part of the same aristocratic circle. The two families closely interacted during the French Revolution. Both Tocqueville and Custine's families belonged to the highest, very highest ranks of nobility, and both became victims of the revolutionary terror. Custine's mother once sought refuge at the Château de Malesherbes in 1792. Now, Malesherbes was Tocqueville's great-grandfather. This was 1 year before 1793, before many members of the two families were arrested. Malesherbes, who was the king's lawyer, was beheaded, but only after the executioners had him watch several of his children die on the scaffold in front of his own eyes. Nice guys. Only Robespierre's sudden arrestation and fall freed Tocqueville's parents from the same fate. They had recently married. They were in jail waiting for their turn. In jail too was Custine's mother, Delphine, at one point sharing a cell with Joséphine de Beauharnais, Napoleon's future wife. Delphine's husband and father-in-law, in other words, Custine's father and grandfather, were both beheaded when young Custine, still a toddler, was kept at home by a servant under somewhat heroic circumstances. So that gives you a sense of the revolutionary terror and what it did to the noble families. Although Tocqueville was 15 years younger than Custine, Tocqueville was born in 1805, the two had, if not similar, parallel childhood memories. Because Chateaubriand was the greatest of French romantic writers, was a mentor to both, to the two of them. Custine grew up with Chateaubriand, who was for several years his widowed mother's lover. And Chateaubriand declaimed some of his best-known verses, the Martyr among them, one of the greats of Chateaubriand's poetry, in the evening in front of the admiring child, who never ceased to admire his mentor and for a while mother's lover. Chateaubriand, by the way, was also the younger brother of Tocqueville's guillotine uncle. And he spent much time with the Tocqueville family. Chateaubriand devoted some pages to both Astolphe and Alexis in his Mémoires d'outre-tombe, the Memories from Beyond the Grave. Of note, however, Chateaubriand never promoted the literature ventures of Astolphe, but he was one of the great champions of Alexis' democracy. Both men, Custine and Tocqueville, had their own battle to fight with their aristocratic milieu and circles. And this requires some elaboration. Tocqueville fought aristocracy from within. He used to say that he was an aristocrat by temperament, by instinct, but a democrat by reason. He remained loyal to his aristocratic family, to his friends. He saw them all the time, childhood friends. He remained respectful of his milieu, and yet he relentlessly confronted them politically. Custine, however, was rejected by his aristocratic circles. You'll understand why in a moment. He was rejected by the very people he wanted to support politically. He remained all his life a loyal monarchist and a devout Catholic, even as he was excluded for transgressing social norms. More on that in a moment. Young Custine briefly tried diplomacy as a job. Chateaubriand arranged for him to assist Talleyrand at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. That's the Congress at the end of the Napoleonic years that reorganized the map of Europe and the geography of Europe and created the new states and the 19th century political order. So Custine tried his hand at diplomacy in a small way, but still assisting the great Talleyrand. Then for a good long time, Custine lived the life of a young aristocrat. He was a much sought-after bachelor in the fashionable salons of the aristocratic circles, but he never took the bait. He never married. A first scandal emerged in 1818 after Custine broke off an engagement with the daughter of literary salon hostess and novelist Duchesse de Duras. Custine's sexual orientation was accidentally revealed publicly not long after. In 1824, soldiers left him beaten and naked on the street after an encounter with one member of the garrison. Madame Swetchin, the Russian émigré and hostess who later became Tocqueville's religious advisor, was horrified by Custine's transgression. Custine was rejected by polite society as an openly gay man in the Paris of the Restoration years. I was not seen often. He was excluded from the very group of people he defended so relentlessly against modernity. Only one close family friend congratulated Custine on breaking off his engagement because he was remaining true to himself. And this was not a French friend, it was a German friend. It was Rahel Varnhagen, an older German woman of letters, a famous literary hostess in Berlin, who admired Goethe as much as Custine admired Chateaubriand. We know of this woman primarily because philosopher Hannah Arendt, political philosopher Hannah Arendt, a century later identified with Rahel Varnhagen and wrote her biography, The Life of a Jewess, a book where Arendt told the life of a person who, like herself and like Custine, felt rejected even when at the center of attention. Ostracized, Custine sought refuge in literary circles. His transgression actually raised his visibility quite a bit. He developed friendship with Balzac, with Stendhal, later with Victor Hugo, and with musician Chopin. Custine's broken engagement indirectly inspired Stendhal to write his first, and some say his best novel, where the protagonist cannot marry the woman he loves because of a secret. That secret that was revealed in this incident. By the way, I almost finished this book today by the lake. Stendhal's book, I never read it before. Independently wealthy, Custine became prone to an extravagant lifestyle, and he wrote a series of partly autobiographical novels which have not survived the test of time. In Baudelaire's Judgment, there was a dandy mixing uniquely great pages with awkward and lengthy pronouncements. Custine also tried theater, even self-financed the representation of a play, but it failed. There was only one performance. Now, something changed. Custine tried a different genre. Balzac soon thought that Custine finally found his unique voice as a writer when he abandoned novels and when he abandoned theater and turned instead to travel narratives in the form of collections of letters sent along the way to fictional correspondence. Balzac recognized in the new Custine the moralist who knew how to touch your heart. Custine's first destination was Spain in 1831, the country of absolutism. And the topic of Custine's new kind of book, Spain under Ferdinand VII. Spain under Ferdinand VII. It was Chateaubriand, again, who as foreign minister had orchestrated the French invasion of Spain in 1823. Why that invasion? The invasion aimed at restoring Ferdinand VII to power against liberal forces and giving the French Bourbons, the French royal family, the military prestige they lacked by invading Spain and restoring absolutism. Back in power, Ferdinand VII abolished the existing constitution that constrained them and imposed absolutist rule. That was what Custine was promoting. And amidst romantic descriptions of Spanish landscapes, well-written descriptions of Spanish landscapes, and bullfights, of course, generating popular consensus, Custine inserted in that book a lengthy criticism of the first volume of Tocqueville's Democracy in America. A really interesting piece. The legitimist Marquis rejected Tocqueville's idea that American democracy was the outcome, I quote Tocqueville, God's design for human societies. No. He saw it instead just as the rule of the crowd. Custine, yes, praised Tocqueville's intelligence. He recognized, hey, it's a pretty good book. But he rejected his faith in democracy. And he argued it's very simple. There will always be more wisdom and enlightenment in the ideas of a few superior men rather than in the opinions of the crowd. Full stop. In these pages, Custine denounced democracy as an unfortunate improvisation, American democracy as an unfortunate improvisation. I quote him, a political abstraction by a group of American colonists who had to improvise a basic society on a land without memory. Now, turning to labels, and one that is often used actually in French circles, Custine tagged American democracy Puritanism's masterpiece. The French love to say that Americans are Puritans. Well, at the same time, in a strange mix of references, Custine denounced American democracy as the dangerous consequence of 18th century philosophy, of 18th century philosophy's encroachment on the religion of our fathers. There is no record anywhere that I could see, and I think I'm well positioned to say that, there is no record anywhere of Tocqueville taking notice of Custine's attack on him in this book, which is a bit of a mystery to me, as Tocqueville was sensitive to criticism and he was prone to responding to attacks on this book. Now, after Spain, Custine decided to go to Russia to affirm his case for despotism and against democracy. And he was very clear about that. He wrote, I went to Russia to seek for arguments against representative governments. That was his mission. And he took with him his anti-American feelings. He wanted to collect evidence in Russia to free the world from the contemplation of the future which America is promising to Europe. So there was an American promise, then Russia was going to be the evidence that we shouldn't believe in this promise. Tocqueville in his book had argued, and I quote, that America was more than America. It was the future of human societies. No, not so, argued Custine. There is an alternative. There was another reason. Custine and his companion, an Englishman with whom he shared his life, openly, as I said earlier, had welcomed in their home a third man, a young Polish refugee by the name of Ignacy Górowski, from an old Polish noble family whom the Tsar Nicholas I had banished from Russia and Poland and from the court and deprived from his family domain because of a dispute they had with him. Countess Fredericks, born Górowska, Ignacy's sister, however, remained a close friend of the Empress. And she had Custine, who wanted to go to Russia, admitted at court by the Tsar, thanks to her friendship with the Empress, with the intention for Custine to plead Górowski's cause, to plead their brother's cause with the Emperor, and had him readmitted. Custine then departed for Russia and the Russian court with lofty expectations and the best of recommendations to achieve his goals and fulfill this mission. Custine spent most of 1839 in Russia. He spent much time in both St. Petersburg and Moscow, but he also traveled along the Volga River all the way to the Ural Mountains. When he returned, he resorted to the same literary device he had used for the book on Spain. He collected his thoughts in the form of letters written to fictive correspondents throughout the trip, 56 tightly written letters where he relates his every moment and conversation. It's a very long book. It's 4 volumes. It's fine print, about 800 or 900 pages of this description of his trips, his reason for going, whom he saw, every moment of it. Early on, still on the boat, crossing the Baltic Sea on the way to Petersburg, Custine related a conversation with a Russian prince who praised Russian despotism. The prince argued, and it went wide into feeding into Custine's presupposition, that to impose upon nations, I quote, to impose upon nations the domination of majorities is to subject them to mediocrity. The majority is mediocrity. And Custine couldn't agree more. The consensus among travelers on the boat, visitors and Russians returning home, was that democracy generated mediocrity, to be sure, but not only mediocrity, but also boredom. You know, those were aristocrats talking about what their vision of democracy. As it turned out, 2 American businessmen were on the boat, were voyagers on the way to Petersburg. And in an early letter from Russia, Custine related this trip and ridiculed these Americans, these proponents of democratic equality. Americans, he argued, have no idea what a good life is. They are mere Puritans who do not know how to have a good time. And it showed on the boat. And I continue quoting Custine. Innocent laughter, singing, and Russians on deck offend them. These inhabitants of the New World do not permit themselves even a smile at the foolish pleasures of the young European women. They do not perceive that liberty and carelessness are the safeguards of youthful hearts. Their Puritanism rebels not only against license, but against mirth. They are Jansenists of the Protestant school. To please them, life must be made one protracted funeral. Unquote. Custine expected to find just the opposite in Russia. But Custine changed tune dramatically as soon as he set foot on land and was confronted with bureaucratic tyranny beyond what he could ever have imagined. Now, whereas Tocqueville had disembarked in the United States with surprising ease, Custine entered the land of useless formalities, as he put it, whereas Tocqueville had been free to go wherever he pleased and talk to whom he wanted. Custine was tightly controlled. As guest of Tsar Nicholas I, Custine was given guides and interpreters who closely monitored every step throughout his travels. Now, soon Custine turned his notes and his narrative into a 600-page piece of muckraking. Period. It's an interesting, complete shift. Again, I don't think we should read Custine as a history book. I'll get back to that at the end of the talk. But mostly as a piece of muckraking and as a powerful piece of muckraking. I read every line of it, pencil in hand. It's really kind of fun to read in a way. Now, some had warned Custine that he was entering an empire of fear, but he hadn't listened. At least one voyager had argued that Russian despotism pays little respect to ideas and sentiments and also denies facts, that despotism struggled against evidence and triumph in the struggle. Custine, who had been deaf to this warning, was finding out for himself. He was entering a society that, in his own words, did not recognize human agency. Soon in his letters, Custine characterized Russia as a nation of slaves. Now, make no mistake, Custine was not referring to serfdom, because he hardly saw serfdom. He was not authorized to see anybody but aristocrats and people at court or related to them. He talked only about the aristocratic society he was allowed to visit with. But he realized that no Russian aristocrat could stand up to the Tsar, least among them the nobles who resided at court, because the court was the place where a nation of slaves could take its cues from an absolutist government. Custine argued that Russians were in fact all courtiers and behaved accordingly. Soldiers, spies, jailers, executioners in this land all do more than their duty, all ply their trades as parasites, he said, that is at the expense of others. And then he continued, who shall tell to what lengths a society may not go which is not built on the foundation of human dignity? Living in fear, and I think this is this notion of fear that Custine was very good at rendering in this book. Living in fear, Russia had become, Custine argued, a nation of mutes, where some potent magician has transformed 60 million men at the time into automats who must await the wand of another chanter before they can enjoy life. In this system, Custine added, victims were willing accomplices to their tyrants. Custine had intended to defend despotism. He had not expected he would find a deep connection between despotism and tyranny. Now he discovered that despotism and tyranny were inseparable. And I mention this because in one of his best phrases, he was quite a good writer, when he moved out of bad novels to write these travel narratives, as Balzac said, Custine connected the two concepts, tyranny and despotism, very tightly. He coined a phrase that actually the French dictionary is still using, the French Laos dictionary, to give meaning to the word parent. I'm your parent, I'm your relative. Custine wrote that despotism and tyranny are such close parents that they never fail to unite in secret to the misfortune of mankind. And it's amazing, I have recent edition of the Grand Larousse. I mean, recent, maybe not so recent, but it's right there, and it's really an interesting way of putting the two together. All around him, Custine saw a society with no basis in human dignity and living in fear. He gave many examples of Russian barbarity, but I'll mention only once. Instead of admiring the Winter Palace, he noted the extreme oppression that made it possible to build the Winter Palace in only 1 year with 6,000 workmen, forgotten martyrs. Of these, he wrote, a considerable number died daily, but the victims were instantly replaced by other champions brought forward to perish in their turn in this inglorious breach. And the sole end of these sacrifices was to gratify the caprice of one man. In another typical passage, Custine warned not to be fooled by the appearance of civilization. If you look at the court and the people who are its worshippers, you may suppose yourself among a nation far advanced in social culture and in political economy, but when you reflect on the relations which exist between the different classes of society, when you observe how small the number of these classes, finally when you examine attentively the groundwork of manners, you perceive the existence of a real barbarism, scarcely disguised under a magnificence which is revolting. Custine concluded that the social cost of the marriage between tyranny and despotism was simply too high. The magnificent feast at court, the displays of women's jewelry, the gilded military uniforms were emblems of a kingdom of facades, really a kingdom of fear and silence, without respect for human life. Custine returned to France in late 1839, but he published the 4 volumes of Russia in America in 1839, only in 1843. Before he sat down to write this book, he had not reread Tocqueville since the Spanish book. He continued to harbor feelings of hostility towards him. I say this because in February 1841, again, he returned from Russia at the end of 39. He published a book in 43. In 1841, Custine finally met Tocqueville in person for the first time at Madame Récamier's salon. Madame Récamier was one of the great hostess of the early 19th century. Chateaubriand dominated her salon at the time. Tocqueville left no record of this meeting, but Custine did, and he clearly was not impressed. He wrote to Varnhagen, that is, his German confidence real widower at the time, I have met Monsieur de Tocqueville, who wrote on American democracy. He is short, skinny, sickly, but still young. He's somehow both elderly and childish. He's the most naive of ambitious men. He can be charming, but he's clearly calculating. His opinion is merely a means to an end. This is what the new star of our political horizon is like. So Custine wrote this to Varnhagen in 1841. But regardless of his reservation on that day, he must have returned to Democracy in America shortly thereafter. And not just the first volume available when Custine wrote Spain in 1835, but also the second volume Tocqueville published in 1840. And he borrowed key concepts from both. I detected Tocqueville's unmistakable influence in key passages of the Russian book. And I think the modest contribution I can claim for this paper today is to have identified in Custine's volume some sections where Custine relied on Tocqueville's concepts to evaluate the situation on the ground in Russia as he saw it, and to condemn it in this piece of muckraking. In this introduction to democracy in America, Tocqueville had made much of how the French kings had been the most energetic and the most constant of levelers, of people who actually introduced equality. How did they introduce equality? By taking the power of the aristocracy away, by turning independent nobles into subjects, by fighting the nobility and by centralizing power at court. Custine built on this idea by showing how the Tsar had similarly killed aristocratic liberty in the name of unity. He pointed to Peter the Great's reforms, especially the new system of military ranks Peter the Great imposed for the administration of the empire that superseded older titles of nobility and neutralized the power of the nobility prone to claim independence. There were other important borrowings from Tocqueville. Tocqueville pointed to the importance of lawyers in American politics as guardians of a special repository of knowledge, in the system of law based on precedents rather than codes. You have a group of people who know all the precedents and they have special knowledge. In Tocqueville's mind, American lawyers holding this special knowledge were a substitute of sort to a European nobility. Custine specifically insisted there was no such group in Russia for the simple reason we couldn't find lawyers in a country where there was no justice. Now, Tocqueville underscored the growth of the middle class as a key to the functioning of American democracy. Custine, of course, found no equivalent in Russia. After specifically acknowledged the absence of any significant middle class emerging from the trades, whatever he saw of them, he characterized the Russian people as a flock guided by a few well-trained watchdogs. Custine also resorted to yet another typically Tocquevillian concept, that which we discussed yesterday, thanks to Sarah's calling our interest and attention to it in detail, self-interest properly understood, or self-interest rightly understood. The two translations go on, or l'intérêt bien entendu, as she prefers to say. And Custine said that in Russia, and she used the term, it was impossible to turn self-interest into the foundations of morals. Tocqueville made much of the mutual reinforcement of liberty and equality on American soil. Equality helps secure and promote liberty and self-achievement. This positive liberty we discussed yesterday as well, as that was the key to self-achievement. Tocqueville even imagined an extreme point where liberty and equality could theoretically be one and the same. Why? Because if you are totally free, everybody's equal, and if everybody's equal, you're totally free. But equality in Russia equality and liberty in Russia were mutually exclusive. Equality reduced the mass to a common level and was a precondition of despotism. One of the dangers that Tocqueville called on was realized there. Custine left France scared by the abuses of liberty. He returned from Russia persuaded that representative government is not the most moral, but it is practically the most wise and moderate, preserving the people on one side from democratic license and from the other from the most glaring abuses of despotism. Custine acknowledged that upon his return from Russia, he had become an enemy of despotism, a partisan of constitutions, and of a government that renders the citizen independent, not by the elevation of sentiments, but by the operation of laws. So Custine now endorsed the comparisons between the US and Russia Tocqueville had made at the conclusion of his first volume. Now let me say a word in conclusion about the legacy of this. Russia in 1839, published in 1843, was an instant bestseller. He did much better than Volume 2 of Democracy in America in 1841 that didn't sell very well. The book went through multiple printings and was translated into all the main European languages. There are estimates out there of 200,000 copies, but they are hard to verify. I want to stay by them. The Tsar, of course, upset to have opened the Russian court to Custine and feeling unrequited, forbade the book in Russia, but that only stimulated its secret distribution. Nicholas I even toyed with the idea of hiring none other than Balzac to write a rebuke of the book, while Balzac feared that his friendship with Custine might instead entice the Tsar to make trouble for his Polish companion he would eventually marry, Madame Anska. Custine became famous. A 19th century novelist by the name of Barbey d'Aurevilly wrote that Russia in 1839 should be read not as a history book, but as a history lesson. Barbey was a friend of Custine, and he too personally disliked Tocqueville. The three happened to be neighbors in Normandy. But the distinction Barbey made between a history book and a history lesson is apt, I think, and applies also to Democracy in America. Both Russia in 1839 and Democracy in America were history lessons, and this has been indeed the role they have played since their publication. There have been many Tocqueville revivals, as Democracy in America has been read anew many times according to political circumstances. There have been some Custine revivals too, none more important than during the Cold War. George F. Kennan, the American diplomat stationed in Moscow after World War II, was the architect of containment. That is, the doctrine advocating containing the Soviet Union within its existing boundaries and preventing its growth further. Kennan, who had read Custine closely, wrote one of the key documents of the early Cold War in the Truman administration, the famous Mr. X article in Foreign Affairs, to argue this position. Later, as a scholar, Kennan authored an important book on Custine, simply entitled The Marquis de Custine and His Russia in 1839. Kennan argued that Russia in 1839 was in fact the best of books about the Russia of Joseph Stalin, and not a bad book at all about the Russia of Brezhnev and Kosygin. Commentator in the French press nowadays, and I read several of them this summer in the Figaro, in Le Monde, and other newspapers, are reading Tocqueville anew to divine, the Russia of Putin. As one chronicler put it in Le Monde just a couple of months ago, as soon as one worries about Russian behavior, one remembers Custine, and he returns. The question for us, of course, is whether the dichotomy between the US and Russia, Tocqueville posited at the end of Volume 1 of Democracy in America, still hold for us. Can our America still be the guarantor of liberty, the enemy of servitude, ensure the survival of democracy? So, after last night's debate, and today on the anniversary of 9/11, this is surely the question we're all asking ourselves right now. Thank you. Maybe I was over wrong.
Yes, now I'd like to welcome Sarah Gustafson and Mike Bressler. Did you get the wrong room? We might not have him. That would be very disappointing. I don't know if he took ill or what, but I don't see him in the room. Okay, well, I will introduce Sarah, and if Dr. Bressler comes, I'll introduce him as well. I saw him today. He was coming, yeah. What?
He was in the office earlier and
Yeah.
said, I'll look forward to seeing you. So.
You have to turn that on. Okay, well, for those of you who are not here last night, Professor Gustafson is Assistant Professor of Politics at the Catholic University of America. She earned her BA from Davidson College, MA from University College of London, and her PhD in political theory from the Department of Government, Harvard University, where she focused her research on Alexis de Tocqueville and 19th century political thought. And you can read the rest of her biography in the brochure. I think I will introduce Mike because I saw Rob go out. Maybe he can find him. But Mike Bressler is Professor of Politics and International Affairs here at Furman. He earned his BA from Ohio State, or I should say the Ohio State University, and his AM and PhD degrees from the University of Michigan. And think about that for a moment. He's a split personality. His areas of expertise are international relations and comparative politics, and he is the editor of and contributing author to the book Understanding Contemporary Russia, which is now in its second edition. So when he comes, we'll just be polite and applaud him. But anyway, let's give our panelists a welcome. So, Sarah, since you are the panelist on the spot right now, do you have reactions to Professor Zunz's extraordinary piece here?
Yes, I do. I have notes. Well, first off, I want to say what a pleasure it is to be up here with you. I've really loved getting to know you over the last day, and I want to plug his book again. That is sitting somewhere. It makes a wonderful gift for your parents.
Yeah.
I read it, loved it, made it a Christmas gift for my father. He read it and loved it. And it's just beautifully written such that someone who has a knowledge of Tocqueville could appreciate it, but also someone who's not familiar could also appreciate it. And that's a testament to his beautiful writing. I was thinking as you were giving these remarks about a conversation once had at my dinner table with an exchange student that came to Davidson from Russia. I had befriended her, and she came home for a long weekend. It must have been spring break or something, to spend time with my family. And so my parents were asking her questions about her experience in the United States and her homeland. You know, she thinks she was from Siberia, actually, quite cold. And so she was sharing these interesting anecdotes about, well, it's amazing how much cheaper winter coats here are in the United States. They're very expensive in Russia. I've bought a bunch of winter coats. And my father asked her a question about Putin, you know, treading somewhat lightly. And she said that she has, well, not her, but her family has very bad memories of the Yeltsin years because of the profound instability of the country, and that Putin reduces that instability and that this is a good thing. So she gave a hearty defense of the Putin regime, which is always a kind of remarkable thing to hear. And she was very sincere about it. And so that leads, I think, into one of the things that I found most interesting about your talk is this distinction that Custine wants to make initially between despotism and tyranny. So I'd like to invite you to comment a little bit more on that, particularly given the fact that he sounds like he had a deep antipathy to Enlightenment political philosophy. So in the Enlightenment, you have this move, Diderot, other thinkers, in favor of enlightened despotism, right? That you can have a Catherine or a Peter the Great, some figure like this that has been enlightened according to new liberal principles, but rules in a despotic manner. And so I wonder if that's part of why he thought despotism could be distinct from tyranny? I would love to hear a little bit more on that distinction, because I think it's a very, very interesting one, particularly given that he is not going to be a fan of Enlightenment political theory and yet seems to be a fan of a certain kind of despotism. So I wonder, and at least initially, before he sees that these two are co-parents, how he understands despotism as different from tyranny. And I would also love to know whether in his travels he noticed any kind of revolutionary activity. Is there any sense of the sort of beginnings of what will come later, and gradually and then very quickly in the 50 to 75 years after? And if he doesn't, is that a product of this very tight schedule that Nicholas I had him on, or is that he wasn't that wasn't something he was attentive to? So I'll start with those two.
I think I'm just going to sit down. I'll take advantage of the open chair.
These are not so easy. I mean, they're good questions, but the answer isn't so easy. I think your college friend who's praising stability had a point. That is clearly there was a great deal of instability with perestroika, and it's interesting that the perceptions we have from the outside and from the inside is often completely different. Now, I believe that the concept of enlightened despotism never entered Custine's mind. I'm not exactly sure why. He just didn't. That is to say, it was not a category he was working with. He was thinking that authority, religion, he remained, even though he transgressed social norms, he remained very religious. He had no real interest in political philosophy. He had interest in literature and in language. And he was himself, perhaps if I had to characterize him, as the embodiment of a romantic character. If you read Chateaubriand's René, for example, he would be the embodiment of a living René, lost on the banks of the Mississippi, trying to figure out what his next move might be. So that is the kind of character he had, and that was the relationship he had with Raoul van Hagnen, who was this admirer of Goethe. They met there, this kind of mix of German and French romanticism. So the sort of enlightened despotism that would produce Catherine or the Diderot, who dedicated the encyclopedia to her and so on, was not part of that world. Now, in terms of the revolutionaries, he never talked about the revolutionaries in the sense you talked about them. He talked about the Decembrists, the people who tried to rebel against the Tsar, and how severely repressed they were and eliminated. Yeah.
Great.
I was just wondering, when Custine is going to Russia, this notion that this is some sort of utopia just escapes me. But I guess I can see the combination of religion and absolute monarchy and aristocracy attracts him. But so but what is his vision of this good non-Puritan life look like? Because that is certainly not the impression I get of 19th century Russia, being mirth-filled and joyful and somehow the embodiment of the good life. It all seems to be, oh, good. It all seems to be difficulty all the way down. So I was just sort of wondering about that. No, 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 no. You are sitting here and I am standing up. I just sat down because I had an empty seat.
I'd like to apologize. I'm playing the absent-minded professor today.
Okay.
Anyway, I thought it was at 6:30, so which means I'm actually 25 minutes early. But
Yeah,
anyway,
you're fine. You're great. Well, we already introduced you, so let's welcome Mike Bresson.
and this is. I'm setting a very bad example for my students about being on time. So anyway, just don't tell anyone.
All right. Well, I've just asked a question of Professor Zunz, so do you wish
okay.
to address that?
Yeah, I think this is actually a very good question. You know, I'm going to answer by bringing up both Tocqueville and Custine in the answer. That is, Tocqueville went to the U.S. to try to figure out, at least in part, how he, a young aristocrat who was still a monarchist at the time, could ever live in a democracy, so he had to see one. The element of genius in that movement is that Tocqueville jumped over England, because French liberals of the day were really looking at constitutional monarchy as the way of the future. There was Guizot and whatever. From Montesquieu on to Guizot, there was England was the model. Tocqueville, who would eventually go to England, just bypassing England altogether, and said, if I'm going to try to see the future, I want to go to America, see what a democracy is like. That is where there is a real connection between government and the people, which is not mediated through which is more direct than anywhere else. Now, I think Custine went to Russia as he was rejected from his aristocratic circles for social transformation. He went to the Russian court to see what it was like to still live like an aristocrat, and he discovered what he called Russia was really the fate of aristocracy in Russia. I think I should make that point clearer actually in the paper.
So the top 0.5% or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Well, Mike.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Mike, we're going to give you an opportunity to respond. Fortunately, he did read the paper, so he wasn't waiting for the talk. So, go ahead.
I do have to say, I don't think I deserve a place right now since I was so late. But anyway, so I am the Russia specialist on the panel, and my comments will focus briefly on what I think Custine got right. But I'm going to talk at length, just in a couple of minutes here, about the significant things that Custine missed. I would like to make clear that my comments do not represent a critique of Professor Zunz's paper per se, which I enjoyed immensely, but are instead a critique of Custine's approach to understanding Russia. In some respects, Custine was right. Nicholas I's regime was repressive. I mean, no one could miss that. The imperial Russian system did concentrate far too much power in the hands of one person, the Tsar. It's also true that Russia did not have a lot of lawyers. When you don't have a system based on rule of law, there's really not much need for them. There also wasn't much of a middle class. This is still a couple of decades before industrialization would begin. Custine's characterization, though, of Russian society as being inert, however, misses important elements that were clearly present in Russian society in the late 1830s. Despite certain accurate descriptions of the country's shortcomings, I would like to suggest that Custine, in his reporting on Russia, was engaging in a form of othering. The operative question, which in this case would be, what's the matter with them? Because they certainly aren't like us. Was Russian society as inert as Custine suggests, however? Were there no sources of change? As it turns out, there were many, but Custine seems to have been unaware of them. Simply put, he underestimates Russian society and the potential role it could play in helping bring about eventual change. Indeed, by the time Custine had visited Russia during the summer and early fall of 1839, and by the way, just as an aside, as a Russianist, not to visit Russia during the winter, you got to be, yeah, exactly. You've got to be much more modest in your claims. And interestingly enough, early in the book, Custine actually says, well, Russians I've spoken with have said, you need to be there at least 2 years before you start drawing any conclusions, which I think actually is good advice, which of course Custine ignored. By the time he visited Russia in the summer and early fall of 1839, liberalism was already on the rise within intellectual circles in the country. And a debate within these circles and other circles that would dominate the 1840s between forward-thinking Westernizers and backward-gazing Slavophiles was about to begin. By the time Custine visited Russia, its golden age of literature had already begun. In 1839, Turgenev, Dostoevsky, and Tolstoy were still yet to come, but Gogol and Lermontov were already writing, and the greatest of Russia's poets, Alexander Pushkin, had died just 2 years before. And interestingly enough, too, all three of these last periods were actually critics of the Tsarist system. And Pushkin at times would essentially be put under house arrest. Now, it was a nice house, but still, he was under house arrest much of the time. And Gogol wrote satires of the Russian system. And lest we forget, Nicholas's reign began in December 1825 with an attempt by liberal-thinking army officers and like-minded civilian intellectuals to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy in favor of constitutional monarchy. The very fact that Nicholas's reign was so repressive means that by definition there must have been something that he thought needed to be suppressed. This isn't something one associates with inert societies. What is Custine's applicability today? I would like to suggest that those who wish to understand Putin and his system would be better served by reading scholarship from the last 2 decades on Russia, as well as some first-rate journalistic accounts of Russian politics and society under Putin. I'm a big believer of it being important to have historical perspective, but not if we fall into the trap of thinking that one Russian autocrat is much like another. If there is a historical analogy to Putin from the Russia's imperial era, Alexander III and Nicholas II are much better comparisons than Nicholas I. And just to give you the genealogy here, Nicholas I, the father of Alexander II, the father of Alexander III, the father of Nicholas II. Not a lot of imagination, by the way, in terms of naming sons, or at least firstborn sons. Nicholas I knew that Russia had to change. Even before the disaster of the Crimean War, he was acutely aware of this. He was afraid, however, of what reform might bring. On his deathbed, he actually exhorted his son, the soon-to-be Alexander II, to undertake reform, to eliminate serfdom, and to undertake other far-reaching reforms. Alexander II and Alexander III and Nicholas II, however, were determined to prevent political change. Alexander III succeeded and Nicholas II failed, but neither could be accused of really understanding or even caring about the significant challenges that Russia faced. Neither could Putin. Indeed, he seems to think that he can prevent change and turn back the clock. He's gotten away with it so far. But eventually, forward-looking elements of Russian society will assert themselves, and Russia will make yet another attempt at transforming itself into a modern society that has as its primary aim serving the Russian people instead of oppressing it. We don't know when, we don't know who, we don't know how. And when it happens, Putin may already be long gone. There may be yet another dictator or 2 or 3. We don't know. But if Russian experience can be taken as a guide, there will eventually be another attempt to fashion a democratic alternative to autocracy. That's all.
Well, thank you very much. Well, why don't we open it up?
Can I say?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I want to say you're completely right. There's no question.
Just get the microphone up.
Yeah, I want to say you're completely right. There's no question that the story is far more complicated than Putin, that Custine puts it. It's actually not even a matter of complication. In the paper, I described Custine's book as a piece of muckraking, primarily, not a historical analysis. But it is a landmark book. So, in other words, so I think that, what you say has to be, I mean, yes, there were the attempts early in the reign of Nicholas I to overthrow him. Custine actually talks about it. There are many reforms he didn't see. It's one-sided. It was one-sided both ways. It was one-sided in the initial praise. It was one-sided in the following condemnation. But the book acquired the status of a classic. Didn't survive as well as Democracy in America, but it keeps coming back. And it played that major role in the conversation on the Cold War, thanks to Kennan, who heralded it, reflected on it, and used it to give some kind of historical precedent to the dictatorship to the Stalin dictatorship and the one that follows after that. And so, in that sense, that's why I did this. But I think in the larger context of things, you're completely right. I mean, this Custine book shouldn't be thought of as a correct historical assessment, but it should be talked of as an assessment that profoundly affected our perception of Russia by certainly pointing out to one of its key realities.
Yeah, I think it's interesting just in looking at some of the commentaries on Custine that, many argue that the book actually is really about him, that it's not so much about Russia in terms of, the various things that he was dealing with. But
it's true that the first part of Custine's book is all about the travails of the French Revolution, the terror, what he undertook. He did this mostly as a way to introduce the reader into this notion that when he talked about dictatorship and martyrdom, he knew what he was talking about because his family and he had lived through it in a different context. Yeah.
Okay, now we'll open up. I think, does Kevin Williams over here has the microphone. And so if you would like to ask a question, you raise your hand, and I see some distinguished professors out there as well, so don't be afraid. Right down here.
Thank you. Over the past 40 years, the last three leaders of Russia have attempted to make changes. Gorbachev wanted to transform Soviet Union into a normal European country and failed. Yeltsin had the same idea and failed as well. Putin, when he first became president, in his Millennium Statement, said that the state is going to play a larger role in Russian affairs, in social affairs, than in Europe, but that doesn't mean we can't be a free country. And then over the past 20 years, he has retreated from that and has become more dictatorial. So the pattern seems to be that a revolutionary change under Gorbachev degenerated into something that Custine might have recognized? That's my question. Do you agree with that characterization?
Yeah, I personally do. Yeah, clearly, and just as what you pointed out, that there is this cycle of hope, and it may return. How and when, and how far, but you can certainly interpret certainly the last few years as a setback. I mean, there's a dramatic setback from our standpoint.
Yeah, I mean the example, the timeline that you've set up there. I mean, it illustrates. Yeah, I mean, Gorbachev was a visionary, and of course, no one will be around here to verify what I'm about to say. But I'm confident that a century from now, that when historians look back at the 20th century, that Gorbachev is going to be viewed as one of the great figures because he was actually doing something truly revolutionary, as you indicate. He wanted a Soviet system that was actually serving the Soviet people. And of course, the problem is, he's trying to hold together an empire at the same time. And once you start talking about democracy, the very logic of democracy means that the captive nations of the Soviet Union were going to want to be free, although many are still captive within the Russian Republic. In Yeltsin's case, you have, no one knows how to do this. How do you go from a planned economy to a free market system? You didn't have a legal structure, you didn't have enough lawyers, and they were getting bad advice from the West. And I would argue this is an example of othering as well. That Western economists viewing Russia, well, now the old system's gone. Now you can become a normal country, but again, it's normal in Western terms. And trying to put in place a capitalist system in a country that doesn't even have a legal system that can support one or any infrastructure to support it, it's not going to work. Putin, the Millennium Statement is fascinating because on the one hand, it seems that he understands political development, but very quickly that degenerates. And I still haven't made my mind up yet, whether this was something he was thinking all along, or if he ended up deciding that the challenges were so great that he needed to revert to the autocratic tradition.
David Spear, his history professor emeritus,
Thank you.
University.
Yeah, so am I correct in thinking that Custine did not travel to America?
Certainly did not.
Okay, so my question is, in your mind, what would the book have looked like if he had traveled to America and published a travel journal about that, or a political assessment along the lines of Tocqueville? What do you think he would have noticed differently, agreed with or disagreed with Tocqueville, approached it completely differently? Thank you.
I have no idea. I cannot think counterfactually. I think nothing was further removed from Custine's intention than going to America. What I think is, I think the relationship with Tocqueville was one of envy and competition between them. Custine was a failed aristocrat, rejected. Tocqueville was the new writer of genius, and that everybody wanted to visit with. And Tocqueville had a difficult political career, but that's something else. He also was part of the academy and of the establishment, which Custine was rejected. So I found that. So I was fascinated by this kind of love-hate relationship. He's part of the same circle. He's almost a cousin of sorts, and yet, and eventually, he turns around and agrees with him. And Russia seems to be the point where this happens. So I think, in a sense, I would be the last person to write a paper on Russia because I have no training in Russian history. I know it only superficially, like anybody here. And I defer completely to the specialist judgment, but the paper is not about that. The paper is about this. In some ways, the paper is about the fact that Custine's change of mind is additional proof of Tocqueville's power of analysis. That's pretty much the way I would rephrase it if I had to.
I think one last question. Dr. Larde. Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks. In the second volume of Democracy in America, well, the mic last time is,
I know.
I'm used to that.
Yeah.
Tocqueville talks about how Americans think, the way they reason, their sentiments and their mores, really investigating the American soul. Does Custine also have discussions on how the Russians, or at least the Russian aristocrats, think, their mores and manners? And are there any philosophical doctrines that Custine thinks the Russians have adopted similar to the Americans adopting Descartes?
No, the Russians are slaves and they shut up. That's basically what it tells you. When they are at court, they don't have a say. So no, there is no attempt in that sense. Russia is kind of a cultural no man's land in Custine's book, which is a major failure of his.
Yeah, I would agree.
For the reasons you mentioned. So it's an important question you raised. Because it shouldn't be that. Because Custine was highly literate. He could argue a case. He wrote extremely well. He was very widely read. So there is something missing there. I hadn't thought of that actually. It's really significant.
He wasn't a very good social scientist, in other words, right? All right. Well, thank you to our panelists, Dr. Mike Bressler, Sarah Gustafson, Olivier Zunz. Let's give them a hand. And as we wrap up this evening, let me invite you to our next Tocqueville event on October 22nd and 23rd, entitled Parties and Elections in America. It's coming kind of close to an election. Maybe we should do something on elections. And joining us to talk about the November election will be Tim Alberta of The Atlantic, Rui Teixeira of the American Enterprise Institute, and two analysts from the Cook Report with Amy Walter, Aaron Covey, and our very own Jessica Taylor, who graduated from Furman. And you're not going to want to miss those two nights. And let me make one more plug. If you're interested in Russia and American foreign policy, in March, we're going to have America's role in the world, and we're bringing in Sergei Radchenko, who is a prominent Russian scholar, and is it Linda Shirk? Shirk, who's a prominent, scholar of China. And so we're going to have America, China, and Russia all in the same room, duking it out for ruling the world. So anyway, I think if you're interested in some of these things, you'll be very interested in March. You're dismissed. Thank you very much.